The title of this is Calamity Jane Goes to School. Calamity was almost 8 when her mother and the preacher's wife decided it was high time she got off her horse and into the schoolroom. Calamity had nothing against reading, writing, and arithmetic, but she sure didn't want to put on one of them girly aprons and sit like a prissy missy on a wood bench. It took Pappy, Jim, and Clem to hold her down so Mama could get that apron over those buckskin pants. All 4 of them walked her to school that day. Not a word passed between them. Miss Agatha Shue was waiting at the front door. She had been teaching there for nearly 29 years. She looked the same on the day that Calamity entered those doors as she did 29 years ago. You can't improve on ugly. People tried to figure out what made her so unpleasant looking. Was it her nose that sat a little off-center and seemed to have a life of its own? Or was it his big ears that somebody called her portable coat rack? Whatever it was, you hoped to good Lord that she didn't have a twin. Calamity didn't smile when she passed through that open door. Miss Shue paid no attention because she hadn't smiled herself for 29 years. She motioned for Calamity to sit next to the 3 girls at the front row bench. The boys stopped snickering and mumbling as soon as Miss Shue took her place in front of the one-room schoolhouse. Nobody messed with Miss Shue. She gave orders like a United States general. She didn't really look at her students. It was more like she looked right through them. Each day she marched to her battlegrounds. She covered reading, writing, arithmetic like a Gatling gun rattling off its ammo. She didn't believe in questions, so nobody asked them. Miss Shue didn't waste any time on Calamity's first morning. She passed out black slates to everybody. Calamity couldn't decide which was harder, listening to her or looking at her. She had a high-pitched bird voice, something like a gooseberry warbler. Right away, she put Calamity in with the children she called her dunces. Every one of them had a tall, cone-like dunce hat on. She started to put one on Jane's head, but when Jane's hair instinctively stood up, ready for a fight, she wisely backed off, with the hat still in her hands. Miss Shue puckered up her mouth and made some sounds that she called vowels. Calamity glared as everybody puckered up and imitated Miss Shue. The morning dragged on till they had puckered and imitated 5 vowels and sometimes Y. Miss Shue rang a bell with a long brown rope on it, and everybody poured out the door like water gushing out a spigot. The girls gathered on one side of the schoolhouse, giggling and talking girl talk. Calamity pulled the strings and stepped out of that missy-prissy apron faster than you can say Clementine. She raced and wrestled with the boys till the pecking order was established, and of course, Calamity was on top. When recess was over, Calamity watched everybody line up like a bunch of dumb sheep. If it was possible, Miss Shue got uglier as the day wore on. She marched around the room with her ruler smacking shins, ankles, and wrists. Important is as important does, thought Calamity to herself. Her grandpappy always told her that really important people don't have to make other people feel unimportant or scared. Miss Shue got all her dunces together once again. Everybody put on their cone hats and sit on the front bench. She had now advanced to the letter C. Say after me, C, C, C. The letter C spells cat, C-A-T, cat. Calamity waited till all the repeating was done. In a bellowing voice, she said, sat. If C is a C, then C-A-T spells sat. Nobody moved. Everybody sat frozen in time. It took Miss Stone a full minute to recover. Nobody had ever spoken and independent thought in this room for 29 years. It was something she had to recover from. After the minute was over, Miss Shue found she had nothing other to say than to repeat again, C-A-T spelled cat. If the truth be known, that was about all that Miss Shue knew anyway. She didn't know anything about the hard and soft sounds that a C could make. Her tiny eyes squeezed down to the size of a pin. She didn't see the slingshot spring out of Calamity's side pocket. Like Wild Bill Hickok, she landed a smooth pedal right in the middle of the big letter C that was hanging at the front of the schoolroom, and nobody could tell how it was done. Who did that? Her high-pitched voice screeched. Everybody started repeating the lesson, C-A-T spells cat, C-A-T spells cat, C-A-T spells. But a few got turned around by all the intellectual discussion and said "sat" as loud as could be. She brandished her ruler over the heads till only the word cat was repeated. Miss Shue fiercely made her way through the next few letters until, unfortunately, she reached the letter G. Repeat after me. G, G, G spells G-O, go! After the repeating was done, Calamity said, no, it don't! Miss Shue was now confronted with the enemy. She rose to her full height and stood looking down her off-centered nose, which made Jane cock her head to one side, trying to give some balance to Miss Shue's face. A kind of choking sound came from Miss Shue's throat. How dare you! Thank you, Miss Shue. I'm always ready to take up a dare. Jane stood on the bench so her eyes could have better leverage with Miss Shue's eyes, not to mention the improved perspective on her nose. Here's the way I see it. If G makes a G sound, then G-O is Joe. Calamity was beaming with pride on how much she was learning on the first day of class. Now, what happened next has been reported with about as many versions as there were people present. To Jane's credit, she did not remove the toad from her buckskin pocket. Anybody who knew Jane's habit wouldn't be at all surprised that she carried little critters around. She thought that Toad and Garden Snake would like spending the day at school, and she'd have some friends to keep her company. Well, Toad squeezed himself out of Jane's pocket and took a flying leap to her shoulder. Toad didn't much like the perspective he had of Miss Shue's face either. That pile of hair on her head looked kind of soft and fern-like, made him think he was leaping to the safety of his pond. Toad nestled down as the ferns parted. Things were happening so amazingly fast that Miss Shue was only aware that a sizable green object had alighted. She did surmise that it was a living object. After a moment of shocked silence, she became a human hurricane. She ripped around that room, across the desk, over chairs, and through the window. Unfortunately, the window was open. People that lived down the road from the school couldn't exactly say what went by. They thought it had some human features, but they kept hearing a great ribbit, ribbit, ribbit coming from it. Well, the long and short of it was, school was closed for the rest of the week. Some say that Agatha Shue visited the doctor at the county seat, and he gave her something to relax her nerves. Most people thought that Agatha should retire and let a new young teacher take over. After all, she had taught most of the people in that town for 3 generations, and no one appeared to be any smarter for it. In fact, some folks felt they had lost some ground. That next week, when Miss Shue once again stood at the door counting the sheep as they entered for slaughter, little did she know that this was to be her last week. Calamity walked by her in her prissy-missy apron thinking, if an old horse don't know when it's time to go out into pasture, then you just got a leader there. A new student walked in right behind Calamity, all dressed up in a prissy-missy apron and a sunbonnet. Now, anybody who cared to look could see that the new student was Calamity's favorite goat, Virginia. But Miss Shue was too busy teaching to look at her students. Virginia sat up as pretty as you pleased and nodded her head every time Calamity did. Miss Shue was growing bolder as the morning went on. Nobody had questioned her when she gave the students cap and go on the spelling list. Now we will review our multiplication tables. She reached for her ruler. Everybody knew what that meant. If there was more than a 1 second delay between the facts, that ruler would flash through the air and nail somebody on the wrist. Miss Shue didn't intentionally hit Virginia. It was simply a part of her routine. Swing to the right, swing to the left, and one swing down the middle. For Virginia's part, she was one of the kindest and gentlest of barnyard animals. Maybe it was Miss Shue's high-pitched screeching voice that set her off. Maybe it was the rat-a-tat-tat of the ruler hitting the ankles, shins, and wrist bones. Whatever it was, Virginia didn't need a ruler to measure the distance between her hind legs and Miss Shue's backside. There was a huge burst of hoofs as a giant whack filled the air. The pupils sitting nearest the window ducked as Miss Shue sailed right over their desks and out the window. Unfortunately, it wasn't open this time. All the children rushed outside. There she was, lying on her back like a fallen general. Her pile of hair had protected her from the broken glass. You could still hear her fighting the war. She was shouting out them multiplication facts like bullets out of a six-shooter. By the time the sheriff and the doctor got there, she was on the multiples of 9. Miss Shue had to retire because somehow her brain got stuck in that one section of the cortex that was reserved for the multiplication facts. And people said she was reciting the 4s when she finally kicked the bucket 10 years later. Calamity stayed in school for another 5 years because a pretty young teacher came from New York. She even let the children ask questions in class.